Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains TV, channel 26.1, also the Voice for Liberty on the internet at wichitaliberty.org. There you'll find show notes about this episode, past episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, and of course, lots more material. Today on Wichita Liberty TV, we have a special guest, Dr. James Otteson. He is Executive Director of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism, the Thomas W. Smith Presidential Chair in Business Ethics, and Professor of Economics at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He's in Wichita to speak this week at the Bastiat Society. So I thank Karl Peterjohn and the Bastiat Society for making him available. So, Dr. Otteson, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thank you very much.
With us also Karl Peterjohn. So, Dr. Otteson, you've been a professor of both philosophy and economics, and that might seem to a lot of people to be two intersecting topics that are coplanar or don't mesh with each other. Do they mesh together? And if so, does that give you any special insight that other economists might not have?
No, it's a fair question. I think for a lot of philosophers on the one hand and economists on the other hand, they don't spend a lot of time talking to each other or reading each other's works, but I think that's actually a mistake. So at the birth of economics, so when Adam Smith was writing his Wealth of Nations in the 18th century, he considered the work he was doing political economy. That was the 18th century term, which is kind of a marriage of moral philosophy on the one hand and what we now think of as economic reasoning on the other. So the idea is, and I think it does make a kind of natural fit, the idea is, what are the moral ideals we would like our institutions, our society to champion on the one hand? That's the moral philosophy part. But then on the other hand, you have to consider what are the constraints we face in our attempts to actually achieve those ideals. Mm-hmm. And so if you can put those two things together, what are the moral ideals given the constraints we face, what's practically feasible given the constraints we face, that can actually lead to policies that are both attractive, morally attractive, but also possible. Mm-hmm. And so that's the ideal world. So if you put those two things together, I think they can make a lot of sense.
Now, when you talk about morality and capitalism, a lot of times people think those are two words that don't really go together. Right. So I think a lot of people, and even me from time to time, we get confused about what really does capitalism as a term mean. Is it the same as business? Because we have a Chamber of Commerce here in Wichita that's very pro-business. I think they'd also say they're pro-capitalism too.
No, those aren't necessarily the same thing. Sometimes, speaking about oxymorons, when I tell people I teach business ethics, sometimes they say, they sort of laugh, is that an oxymoron? A little bit like capitalism and morality. So I don't think that business and capitalism are the same thing, but a certain kind of business, I would call it honorable business, is an important and crucial role within capitalism. So here's what I would give as just a rough definition of these terms. Capitalism is a system where property is owned privately by private individuals, and people have the right to exchange, trade, buy, and sell according to mutually voluntary agreements. When you have a set of institutions that protects that, so you need a set of political institutions that will protect your private property rights, you yourself from invasion, trespass, etc., and also your contracts. You make a promise or contract that should be enforced if it's a voluntary contract. If you have a set of institutions that allows that, then what you get is people engaging in all sorts of trading, associating, innovating, etc. And the sum of that, what we get out of that, is the system that we sometimes call free enterprise or possibly capitalism. Business itself is not the same thing. So oftentimes when people say, well, we want pro-business, I don't know about the particular Chamber of Commerce here, but in general, when people say we want pro-business policies, a lot of times what that ends up meaning in practice is we want policies that favor the current businesses that are already in existence. Not business generally, but let's protect me from competition, or protect me from predatory pricing, or protect me from something else. So that can often bleed into something closer to what we might think of as crony capitalism, which is not exactly the same thing. So under capitalism, what you have is creative destruction. That means you get lots of innovation, new things are being brought into existence, being brought to the market, but there's also the destructive part of creative destruction. And that part you have businesses, firms, even whole industries that as we progress and prosperity increases, they will go out of business. That's unfortunate in some ways, but it's a necessary part of the process of capitalism. So it's not exactly pro-business.
And I think the classic example, we think about the buggy whip makers and so forth when automobiles started. And of course, we're better off today, I think, because we have automobiles and progress like that. So in a moment or so, what's the opposite of capitalism might be?
I would say that the best way to think about the opposite of that is to ask who's making the decisions, the economic decisions. Is it individuals, decentralized? That's capitalism. If it's a centralized group of authorities or experts, that tends to be, so that's centralism versus decentralism. That's something like socialism. That's where you have a group of experts or authorities who are making really the economic decisions for the society.
Rather than individual people doing it themselves.
Correct.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. Let's take a moment off for a commercial break. When we come back, we'll be asking more questions of Dr. James Otteson on Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with our special guest, Dr. James Otteson. Karl, you had a question for Dr. Otteson.
I certainly do. When we've had this discussion in terms of capitalism, and you mentioned crony capitalism, can we go into some more details in terms of how they're similar or differences? I mean, I think of the old Mark Twain story about lightning and lightning bugs, quite a bit of difference between the two of them.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that I don't even like the term crony capitalism because it's like saying a square circle. They don't go together. So there's capitalism and then there's cronyism. So here's a way to think about the difference. So before I talked about the difference between centralism, centralized economic decision-making, and decentralized economic decision-making. The key there is who's making the decisions about how to allocate resources, with whom to associate, partner, etc. Is it individuals on their own terms, or is it somebody else on behalf of individuals? What is cronyism? So what cronyism is when I, as an individual, let's say, or a firm, what I do is I go to someone else, usually someone in the government, and I say, would you please do me a favor? And favors can take a lot of different forms. They can be subsidies, they can be tax breaks, they can be restricting competition or making it more difficult for entry. It can even be things like occupational licensure. New entries into the market need to have a license, and maybe it'll take 3 years to get it, and it'll be $30,000. All of those things, what's the effect of those? What they do is they make it easier for me to succeed in business, but coming at the expense of another person, and you only get that by intervention of a third party. So that's cronyism, very much not the same thing as a free enterprise system.
Well, isn't cronyism synonymous with socialism then?
Well, not always exactly. So socialism will often be in socialism, it'll be the case that the government will actually own a lot of the property. So it might own the factories, it might own the businesses, so there is no private ownership at all. Under cronyism, what you usually have is at least nominal private ownership. So you might own your company and I own my company, but the two of us might collude and get certain protections from the government if we are the ones who are favored by the government. So we might still have private property, even if in some of the practical effects they seem somewhat similar.
So we don't have the 5-year plans like the Soviet Union had during the 50s and 60s and 70s, but yet we have collectivism, collective planning through what? Regulation? Is taxation a form of central planning even?
Oh, sure. And it doesn't, I wouldn't want to suggest that no central planning is consistent with capitalism. So certainly some of the institutions that seem to be required to enable an arena in which people can trade and exchange, in which their property is protected, those at least seem arguably to require certain kinds of centralized institutions. We need rules to protect private property. We need courts to adjudicate disputes, things like that.
And this would be like a police force and so forth?
Right, exactly.
I noticed one of the references you referred to was Hernando de Soto about the mystery of capitalism. And our friend John Todd, he said, the Register of Deeds in Sedgwick County is really one of the defenders of capitalism because that's the person who stores the records of who owns what.
Oh, that's extremely
And they don't
important.
have that in some parts of the world.
That's right. So having actual title to your property, and that can be land or that can be possessions, is enormously important for being able to do something productive with it. If you don't know whether the day you walk off your property to go to a job, somebody else can come and squat on your property and it doesn't belong to you anymore, then you're not going to go to your job. You're going to stay on your property. So the drag on productivity that's created by not having clear title is enormous. And that brings right back to the question of cronyism, or the role of capitalism in connection with cronyism. Part of what we need for capitalism, I think, is clear property rights. And this is a role potentially for the government. You asked about the IRS a second ago, the tax code. Well, if there are courts and there are recorders of deeds, that requires revenue. These are things that I think it's consistent with capitalism to use taxes for. But that's not the same thing as redistributing wealth according to some centralized plan.
So right now, I think government at all levels consumes maybe 40% of GDP, or somewhere 35 or 40.
In the United States.
To have the type of minimal state you're talking about with system of courts and so forth, that might be like 2 or 3 or 4% of GDP, or something very small.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we could be generous and say 10%, but it would certainly be substantially lower than what we have now.
Yeah, very interesting. Milton Friedman talked about capitalism as a system of economic freedom and something that is necessary for political freedom. And so do you agree with that we can't have political freedom without the underlying economic freedom?
I think those are connected in a deep way, and it's often in an unappreciated way. We sometimes talk about, say, a right to free speech. This is a personal right, a political right to free speech. But the right to associate with other people, including economically associate with other people, that's as deeply connected to who I am as a person, to my identity as a person, as those other rights. So I think economic and political freedom, I think they're two sides of the same coin. And if you're going to have one, you must have the other.
Very good. Let's take another moment off for a commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to discuss who today in government is a capitalist and who is not. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl Peterjohn and our special guest, Professor James Otteson. Karl, you have another question, I believe.
Well, obviously, with the new president in Washington, let's talk about Donald Trump, President Trump, and would you view him as a capitalist, and if so, what type?
So I like to retreat into saying I'm a philosopher, not a politician.
Well, I thought you were an economist.
I'm a little bit of that too, okay. It's hard to tell. I mean, I'll try to be as objective as I can about this. I think it's a bit hard to tell exactly what Donald Trump's economic policies are. In some ways, it seems as though he certainly talks about things like that sound pro-market, reducing taxes on corporations, reducing various other kinds of taxes. He's talked about reducing regulatory burdens, which could enable more economic prosperity. On the other hand, one of the things that I think doesn't quite fit with that is his view, or apparently his views about trade. So he seems to see international trade as being something like a zero-sum game. If we buy from some other country, that benefits them at our expense somehow, and maybe vice versa.
A lot of people think that, though.
A lot of people think that, and if there's one thing that I think most economists, maybe almost all economists in the history of economics, have agreed on, it's that trade is good. I mean, think about, so this is one of the frustrating aspects of economic theory, that's one thing that hasn't quite made its way down to into the larger popular consciousness. Trade is good. When people are engaging in mutually voluntary trade, if it's mutually voluntary, it's going to be mutually beneficial. I mean, just think of the word, when you're trading, what are you trading? You're trading goods. You're not trading bads. You're not buying things that are not good, that you don't want, that aren't good for you. Mm-hmm. And if we can buy things in other countries that are less expensive or better quality, or we just happen to prefer them than things that are being made here, that frees up resources that can be used by us to do other things.
We sometimes ask, what's the difference between trading with Mexico and trading with Oklahoma?
Mm-hmm. And I think that captures it very nicely. Or what's the difference between hiring a person who lives next door to you or in the next county? Mm-hmm. What you want is mutually productive relationships, and that can happen. I mean, one of the great things about globalism is that people are different. And people all over the world bring lots of different skills and talents and interests and preferences. So the range of things that's available to us to make our lives better increases the more people we're willing to trade and associate with.
Well, let me look at it from the broad perspective and just ask, with the TPP that he's kind of managed to throw out the window with, I think, 20 countries or roughly 20 countries, and he's saying, no, we'd be much better off doing bilateral trade with, let's say, the U.S. and Japan, or the U.S. and, say, Singapore. And I think we have a free trade agreement with Singapore already, so that may be redundant or outside that. Is there, from your perspective, a significant difference between a large aggregation versus, say, a two-way agreement?
In principle, I would say no, but in practice, there might well be. When you start deciding that you want to have multiple individual agreements with lots of individual countries or lots of individual countries, that introduces the opportunity for a lot more mischief. And one thing I think I have perceived about Donald Trump, about President Trump, is that he's good at making deals. But what it means to make a deal, usually for someone in a position like his, is that there's quid pro quo and reciprocity and negotiation. So it's not going to be, we would all be better off if we just had free trade, because that trade agreement is one sentence long. That's not what's going to end up happening. There's going to be lots of horse trading that goes on, which introduces the opportunity for all sorts of other kinds of things that might have nothing to do with actually benefiting the country or leading to prosperity in the respective countries. It might be other things.
Well, let me try and expand on it a little bit, because when we talk about capitalism, you've got to have a rule of law for capitalism to work. Mm-hmm. And like Bob pointed out, with having the Register of Deeds as kind of a scorekeeper, if that rule of law isn't there, things don't come together. So in the international trade aspect, where do we stand vis-a-vis a rule of law?
I think it's a good question. And when you have, so when the president or any president is negotiating these trade agreements, what you tend to get, the result tends to be whatever the discretionary things that person was interested were. So those things can often be changed. They can often be have addendums and ad hoc resolutions that are just when the next cycle comes along. That's the antithesis of the rule of law. What you want for the rule of law is a stable and predictable and equally applied set of protocols. And if you don't have that, if it's subject to people's decision making or the discretion or whoever happens to get elected next, that's exactly what introduces some of the uncertainty into markets and can act as a drag on production.
So in other words, is uncertainty in your context cronyism?
Not exactly the same thing, although they can have some of the same effects. I think uncertainty can be caused by cronyism because you might not exactly know who's going to be the next crony, so you don't know what's going to happen.
But on the other hand, the future is uncertain. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You have an idea for a product. Do you really know if people are going to like that or not? So we go on like that. We are very dependent on trade here in Wichita, as you might know. The completed aircraft, also big sections of airplanes that we ship up to Boeing to be completed, and also our agricultural products as well. So
and energy.
Yeah, we're very interested in foreign trade here. So that's going to be the end of segment 3. So we've got one more segment here on Wichita Liberty TV this week. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl Peterjohn and our special guest, Dr. James Otteson. Talking about trade again, Donald Trump says he's for trade as long as it's fair trade, but fair trade seems to be a concept that's hard to pin down, isn't it?
It is hard to pin down, so it's hard to know how to evaluate that claim. I mean, I think maybe one of the more generous ways to try to interpret that is to say that we're for trade as long as both parties really they really do benefit from it. I think some people imagine that there are some kinds of trades that take place where one party benefits and the other one doesn't. Mm-hmm. And those are trades that we want to try to avoid. And I think people on all sides of the political aisle would agree with that. So if somebody's being exploited in a way where they don't really have a choice, or they're being there's duress brought to bear so that they're being inclined to make choices they would rather not make, that seems unfair, and that might be what President Trump has in mind. On the other hand, I think we have to be careful not to think that just because somebody else makes a decision, makes a choice, agrees to a trade, or agrees to work for somebody, that that we wouldn't make, that therefore it's bad or wrong. I think we have to remind ourselves that that people are free moral agents, and they get to make choices, and including choices that you or I wouldn't make were we in their shoes, and that's okay. So it's not something that needs to be remedied if somebody else makes a choice that you or I wouldn't have made. Which is not to say the same thing if somebody is coerced into a choice, because there can be still mutually voluntary and mutually beneficial choices and trades that are made that are not the ones you or I would make, and that's okay.
And I think we also have to think about the alternatives that are available to people. For example, sweatshops. We think, oh, the poor people working in sweatshops, but for them, a sweatshop is probably a lot better than their next best alternative.
Yeah, and if what's going on in a sweatshop, if we find something that you want, a particular example that seems egregious, if what's going on there is that people are being lied to, or they're being locked into these buildings, or
enslaved.
Yes, right, or their families are being threatened, and some of those things go on. Well, that's clearly nothing that we would want to endorse, or that we wouldn't want to criticize. But that's different, I think, from saying, well, I wouldn't want to work in those conditions. Well, that may be true, but we can say that from the perspective of a relatively wealthy place, a relatively free place in the United States. So I don't think we have to be careful in applying standards that we ourselves would accept to the situations of other people who might be very different in very different kinds of situations.
So trade is good, but it can also be disruptive for people who are thrown out of jobs or something. And in general, one of the features I think we haven't really explicitly said, but capitalism is based upon economic competition. And people tell me, Bob, economic competition, if this guy wins, that means this guy loses, and he loses bad, and this guy wins big. But that describes more like a sporting event, not economic competition. Am I on the wrong track on that?
No, I don't think so. And I think you're getting it exactly right, because there are different levels of competition. So imagine, for example, within a firm, even a small company, the people who are working at that firm are all cooperating. They're not competing with each other. They're all cooperating to a certain end. Their customers, their potential customers, their clients, what are they doing? They're cooperating. They're not competing with each other. And this is a way in which markets can actually bring people together. So they're thinking about each other and how can I serve you? That's why when you buy something from a local coffee shop, when you give them the money, they give you the coffee, you both say to each other, thank you, because you're both better off.
John Stossel says that the weird double thank you moment.
Right. And that's a really profound element of a market economy. Now, where is there competition? Well, competition can arise at a higher level when we're not really sure what the best use of scarce resources is. Is this company using these resources well? Is that company using these resources well? Can't know that in advance. The only way we can figure that out is by letting them experiment. And that will mean that some of these experiments will fail and some of these experiments will succeed. And even the ones that succeed, eventually they'll all fail too, because something else will come along down the road. And that's all part of the healthy process of creative destruction of capitalism.
Of course, when people fail, that's painful at the time, no doubt about it.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's something with it. Even people who support markets need to remember that there can be displacement, and displacement can cause real disruption in people's lives, and that's certainly true.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't pretend that doesn't exist. It does exist.
But, you talked about the double thank you moment. One thing... we have a lot of controversy this year over school funding. I imagine about every state does. You know what? The people in the schools, they don't often say thank you to the taxpayers. Instead, they just ask for more and more.
That's probably true.
But that's true of government in general, Bob, in terms of whether it's what service or good happens to be provided.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually one of the unfortunate, perhaps unintended negative consequences of having the government at all levels, federal, state, and local levels, be so heavily involved in education. Because inevitably, whatever side of the political aisle a person is on, inevitably when that happens, people start paying attention to the government rather than to the things they should be paying attention to, which is teaching parents, students. And the more the government takes over of that, the more time we spend thinking about politics instead of the students, which is really what we should be thinking about.
Teaching kids in schools.
And you don't have the pricing signals. If you don't have the information on what something costs, how do you value it? And if you're in a situation, whether as an educational consumer or producer, how do you know you're allocating resources properly?
Exactly, yeah. that's what markets do, I think. So, well, Dr. Otteson, we are out of time for today. So thank you very much for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very
Karl
much.
Peterjohn, Bob Weeks for another episode of Wichita Liberty TV. Be sure to look at wichitaliberty.org for show notes about today's episode and tune in again next week.